So this video is going to be a fairly short video. We just have this one slide to discuss decision making. So when we're solving problems and we're making decisions, we are often using prior knowledge and our reasoning ability to help us. However, our ability to reason can be swayed by certain biases, and as a result, sometimes our reasoning is flawed. So we're going to be looking at some very common mistakes that we can make when reasoning in order to come to a decision. So first of all, we have the availability heuristic. So focusing on the most recently available information or experience. Basically, this is the tendency to make a decision based on an example, information, or any kind of recent experience that is readily available to you or easily brought to mind. Okay, hence availability heuristic. Even though it may not be the best example to inform your decision. So, for example, let's say you were planning a trip to San Francisco, and originally your plan was to fly, but you just heard about a plane crash. Okay, so the most readily available information you have is this plane crash. And so you might use that to inform your decision and make the decision to drive, even though your chances of dying in a car crash are much higher than dying in a plane crash. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's the wrong decision to drive. You know, plenty of people do that. But the reasoning to get there was flawed. Your reasoning, well, oh, I might die in a plane crash. I just heard about this. I'm probably safe for driving. Well, actually, you are still safe for flying. Okay, so the availability heuristic, you are using whatever information easily comes to mind to make a decision, even though it might be flawed. And that's what Michelle here is doing. Michelle here assumes that because her grandfather smoked and lived until 90, smoking clearly doesn't kill, and therefore she might be more likely to decide to smoke because that's the information she has that's what she has experienced. That's the information she has available. And so that's what she's going to use to inform her decision, or at least that seems to be the case here, even though it might not be the best information to base that decision on. Then we have the representativeness heuristic. This is also sometimes called the representative bias. So unintentionally stereotyping someone or something. Essentially what you're doing with this bias is assuming that a given sample is representative of the larger population from which it is drawn, and then using that to make a decision. So you're assuming that a couple of people or a few people represent the population that they're from, or maybe it doesn't even need to be people, it might be someone's opinion, and you're assuming that their opinion is reflective of more people's opinion. So to give you an example of that, let's say you're just trying to decide whether or not to go and see a movie. Okay, maybe you hear a couple of people say that it was a bad movie. Okay, the representativeness heuristic or the representative bias would be if you were to then assume that, oh, well, these two people said it was a bad movie, so clearly it's a bad movie and I shouldn't see it. Okay, you're basing your decision to not go and see the movie off of two people's opinion because you're assuming that they must represent everyone else's opinion and it clearly must be bad. For all you know, everyone else thinks it's a great movie and it was just those two people's opinions that you heard that didn't like it. And so as a result, you decide to not see a movie that you may have actually really enjoyed. Okay. Another example of this would be if I asked you to decide whether this man here is a librarian or a farmer. So usually I would ask you to raise your hand whether it's which one you think he is. And usually people assume that he's a librarian, right? Which makes sense in some ways. There's books behind him, he's got a suit on and he's wearing glasses. Basically, he fits the stereotype that we hold for a librarian. So we make the assumption that he is, he's representative of a librarian, he must be a librarian. He doesn't fit our assumption of what a farmer looks like. And so you make the decision that he must be a librarian, even though in reality, he might actually be a farmer. There's no reason he couldn't be. But our judgment was influenced by the stereotype we hold, or this idea that a man with glasses and a suit standing in front of books is more representative of a librarian than a farmer. Then we have the confirmation bias. So this is the tendency to focus on information that confirms your existing beliefs. This happens a lot when we start dating someone. When we're in a new relationship, we think they are the best person in the world. Or we already like that person, and that's our existing belief. So as a result, we focus on all of the things that confirm that this person is the best person in the world. We see all of the things that confirm how great they are, and we rarely notice the bad things until later on. Essentially what this is doing, the confirmation bias, is causing people to discount or overlook evidence that runs counter to their beliefs. So maybe there are some red flags in that new relationship, and maybe people are even pointing out, oh, I'm not so sure about this person because of this reason or that reason, and you can't see it because you are only focusing on the information that confirms the belief that this is a great person. Okay, this is not consciously that you're doing this. This is usually unconsciously that's just where we focus our attention, and we ignore all of those other signs. You see this a lot also with politics. We see the Republicans focus on all the things that confirm their beliefs and ignore the things that go against it, and then vice versa. The Democrats focus on everything that confirms their beliefs and ignore everything else. And so when it comes to deciding who to vote for, sometimes that decision can be biased because you have overlooked evidence that maybe would have changed your decision. Then finally, we have the framing effect. So a decision is influenced by the way information is framed, or in other words, worded. Let's say you have been diagnosed with an illness that could be treated with one of two drugs, and you have to decide which one. So I tell you, drug A, write this for you, drug A has a 35% cure rate, and drug B has a 25% cure rate. Okay. However, both drugs carry a low risk of developing hypertension or high blood pressure. And so you're told that drug A has a 3% risk and drug B has a 2% risk. Oops. So chances are, based on this information, you would choose drug A because its cure rate is 10% higher than drug B, but the chance of developing hypertension is only 1% higher. Okay, so that's a fairly easy decision to make. But what if instead I told you that drug A has a 50% greater risk of causing hypertension than drug B? Okay. Usually at this point I'd ask you to raise your hand whether you would take drug A or drug B. Majority of people at this point will switch and say that they would take drug B. Okay. However, the fact is, both scenarios are exactly the same. Even when it is worded as 50% greater, if drug B has a 2% risk still, 50% of that is 1, right? So drug A, it still means that drug A has a 3% risk. 50% more than 2% is 3%. So in both situations, they are exactly the same. The only thing that has changed is the way I've worded it. And that then influences your decision. So you do want to be careful, especially when people use percentages to describe things. You really want to take a look at what those numbers are because it can be very deceiving. Saying that drug A has a 50% higher risk than drug B makes it sound much worse than it actually is. So there is an example of how the way something is worded can influence our decision.